Okie dokie. Thank you very much, everybody. This is a beautiful full house, and we're really thrilled to see it. Second day of the Port Fairy Literary Festival, and I think we're off to a wonderful flying start. So we have today moderating Danielle Binks, Rob McDonald, author, Lyn Yeowart, author, and I'll let them all talk about themselves.
I wasn't pausing for that, but thank you very much. It's appreciated. Before we begin, I would just like to pay respects to our Indigenous elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge again that sovereignty was never ceded. Thank you. So we have today R.W.R. McDonald, or Rob. He is an award-winning author, a Kiwi. We will not hold that against him. And a queer dad living in Melbourne with his 2 daughters and 1 Harry cat. His debut novel, The Nancys, won Best First Novel in the 2020, is it the Nio Marsh Awards, as well as being a finalist in the Best Novel category. It was shortlisted for Best First Novel in the 2020 Ned Kelly Awards and highly commended for an unpublished manuscript in the 2017 Victoria's Premier's Literary Awards. Nancy Business is his second novel, published in June 2021. Please give a round of applause to Rob.
Thank you.
And then we have Lyn Yeowart, is a professional writer and editor with more than 25 years of experience in writing and editing everything from captions for artworks to speeches for executives. Her debut novel, The Silent Listener, is loosely based on events from her childhood growing up in rural Victoria. She is now happily ensconced in Melbourne, where there is very little mud, but lots of books. Please give a round of applause to Lyn. Now, I'm not going to try and do an injustice to either of your books. So from both of you, I would love the elevator pitch for both your books. And maybe we'll begin with Rob, because you've now got a little bit of a series going. So give us a little bit of elevator pitch of the series, please.
Sure. So The Nancys is adult crime fiction set in South Otago, New Zealand, in a fictional town called Riverstone, population 3,200 and something. It revolves around an amateur detective trio made up of a schoolgirl, Tippy Chan, who in The Nancys is 11 and in Nancy Business is 12. Her babysitters, which is her Uncle Pike and his boyfriend Devon. And both Tippy and her uncle have a love of Nancy Drew and this real drive to try and solve mysteries. So in The Nancys, we have the case of Tippy's school teacher who is murdered, and in Nancy Business, which starts 4 months after The Nancys finishes, there is a massive explosion which rocks the town. So yeah, look, I'm not condoning taking a child to solve any of these, but it's The Nancys. Yeah.
She does a pretty good job, though. I mean, credit where it's due. Thank you for that elevator pitch. And Lyn, The Silent Listener, the elevator pitch, please.
Okay, The Silent Listener is a psychological thriller. It's the story of one family that is kind of trapped and drowning in a series of secrets and lies that start off occurring in the 1940s and end up in the 1990s. I forgot what century we were in there for a minute. The 1990s. There's a missing 9-year-old girl who's never found. There are a couple of other very mysterious deaths, and 2 sisters who decide to return to the farm as adults and take revenge on their father for what he did to them in their childhoods. And things don't quite go according to plan. Yeah, that's about it.
The book is as eerie and brilliant as that title is. The Silent Listener. That is just creep-tastic. I love it. I want to know from both of you, when did you first encounter the crime genre? And I think you've already tipped your hand here, Rob, by mentioning Nancy Drew and naming your series with Nancy in the title. But what made you realise it was the genre for you? And I'm particularly curious if the story came first, or did a desire to write crime fiction come first? And we'll start with Rob.
Sure. So yeah, very early on I read I was reading everything as a child, including Nancy Drew. My sister had some Nancy Drew books, Hardy Boys, and then graduating on to Agatha Christie, Ngaio Marsh, those sort of murder mysteries I've always loved. And particularly as a reader, being able to read along, try and solve the crime before the detectives do. So I had written a few different, I guess, genres, but in 2006, when I decided, when I came across the idea for the Nancys, I did go with the intention that I wanted to write a murder mystery. And then it was, as I was writing, that one of the first things I wrote was this inner dialogue, which was from a child solving a murder, and I followed that thread, and that's how we found the Nancys. But so it was with an intent, and since then, I've met a lot of crime writers, and the crime writing community is super generous and lovely, even though you've got these writers that write really pretty dark stuff. They're actually the most lovely people. And I've found that it's a really interesting space to be able to look at, I guess, societal issues and what's going on and put it in a way that's still a page-turning story. So for now, I'm very comfortable within that community.
And does anyone else do that thing when they read a crime novel, and if you figure it out and you realise by the end that you did figure out on page 50, you think, ooh, I should have been a detective. I should have gone into forensics. Lyn, what came first, the desire to write crime fiction or the story idea?
I think the story idea. I didn't actually set out to write a crime novel, in fact, but at some point I thought about the books that I like to read, and I do like reading crime, and actually I thought, I watch a lot of TV crime and I like that idea of trying to work out who done it, of course. So my early crime reads were, without a doubt, Enid Blyton. Had very limited exposure to books as a child. We didn't have books in the house that I grew up in, except for the Bible and What Bird Is That? That was my, that was all we had at home. So I was limited to, and I went to a tiny rural primary school, so all we had there was, I think about one shelf, or maybe two shelves of books sort of next to the cricket equipment. And so it was Enid Blyton. So, there were smugglers I remember learning the word contraband from Enid Blyton and thinking, my God, that is a magnificent word. And so from there, I progressed when I got to high school. I think Agatha Christie was another one that I really enjoyed reading and still do, in fact, because I think she's a masterful plotter. And I actually read the other day, I'm going to say in preparation for today, in fact, that Agatha Christie is still the most, she has sold more books than anybody, even J.K. Rowling. And according to something that I Googled, she's sold something like 2 billion books, which is, I'm hoping for that.
Yeah.
But I might fall short. I don't know, I just think this... So when I started writing this, I actually thought I was going to write a very highbrow literary piece of literature. But like Rob just said, I did want to write a page-turner. So there's a point at which you think, okay, like when the two sisters come back to look after their father, for me, there was a sort of an epiphany when I realised, they could actually get revenge. And what would they do to get revenge, and then how would they hide maybe any criminal activity that they did in order to wreak revenge on their father? And that was a real turning point, and then it kind of took off.
Well, Lyn, for a childhood devoid of books, look at you now. I mean, pretty impressive. My next question, I'm going to preempt by saying, can you all just double check that your phones are on silent or off? Because this next question's a doozy. You're going to want to listen, and if the phone goes off, you may want to commit blue murder.
We will.
Well, yes, you do have the skill set. My next question for both of you is, you both have some pretty exciting adaptation news, I do believe. would you like to tell us what you can, knowing as I do that these things are normally very contractually clever and you can't say too much, and I don't know how much of a say you have in a television series adaptation or a movie adaptation. So whatever you can tell us, I promise nobody here will go off and tweet that or leak it to the press, though I do see somebody from the press here today. He will not say anything. Rob, what can you tell us about adaptation news?
So it's probably going to end up being a very politician answer. But no, very excited to have signed the screen option rights for the Nancys. So it's with Hoodlum Entertainment, so they're based in Queensland and also in LA. This is where my politician answer comes in. I would very much love to see them on a television streaming show, sort of 6 or 8 1-hour episodes, but I couldn't confirm or deny that.
Would you like it to be filmed in New Zealand as well, or are you pretty open to selling your soul and moving to LA and saying, yeah, that changed the whole thing?
Well, yeah, so again in our Blarney Book of Silence, yeah, so they are very interested in retaining the New Zealand aspect of it. So whether that would be, external, locations, but they certainly wanted. I did ask that whether, because it is I guess it's a small town story which you could adapt, but they were very keen on the New Zealand flavour and humour and to retain that within a series.
And I mean, I think Top of the Lake proved that you can film a pretty decent crime gothic series in New Zealand.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So, they've done pretty well to show themselves off, I think.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Lyn, you similarly have adaptation news that you can... I believe this is breaking news, if you want to call it that. Blarney breaking news. Please share.
I also have signed screen adaptation options for the silent listener. We're a little bit... what's the word? There's not a lot we can say at the moment yet, so it hasn't actually been officially announced, but here we are doing it. I think I can say who it's with, but I think that's the extent of it. I don't know, which is not much. That's with a producer or an organisation called Weir Anderson Films. The primary person in that is Deanne Weir, who actually has interest in hoodlum films as well. So that's about as far as we can go at the moment. There's a little bit more news coming out, but it hasn't actually all been kind of solidified yet, not set in concrete. So I've been told to stay mum, but here we are doing it.
Well, I think we can say that there's a bit of a run-on on Australian New Zealand adaptations, largely because of COVID, because we have been very COVID safe until recently, Sydney. And producers in both the UK and US can see that they can film here quite safely. So there's going to be a lot of content coming out that was largely filmed in Australia and New Zealand very soon. And I think the likes of The Dry, Jane Harper's fabulous adaptation by Eric Bana, has shown that we can get bums in seats to the cinemas. We can get them clicking on Netflix to watch Aussie content. Amazingly, Australians are interested in Australia and telling Australian stories. Try telling our politicians that, please. Tell them to invest in the arts, if you will. Thank you kindly. My next question is, in both of your books, quite a lot happens to protagonists when they are 11 years old. Can we talk about the decision to include children in quite crime-filled, sometimes scary situations? And I mean, even though yours almost sounds like a cosy mystery, Rob, the murder in the first book especially is quite harrowing. Can we talk about the inclusion of children in crime fiction? What made you? Do you think there's power in that? Because these are also children that, much like the Nancys, they know their own minds. They are their own little investigators. Can you talk a little bit about the decision to include children? And again, we'll start with Rob.
Yeah, sure. So, so back in 2006 when I was writing it, I was getting that thread and so I realised it was a child and I followed that thread. But also what was happening, so my two daughters were born in 2007, 2008, and I didn't write the first draft of the Nancy's until 2016, and one of my classmates is here, Jeannie Green. And so that was at Faber Academy. So by then I was a dad. I had my two daughters who, were starting to get to that age of my protagonist. So I had Tippy in my head for 10 years before I wrote it down, and Uncle Pike and the whole cast. But what I'd noticed is during that time, my daughters were born into a world where there was the ISIS beheading videos. There was, for Western countries, there was the bombings that were happening, and so they were growing into this quite a dark world, really, compared to the world that I'd grown up in. I think it was quite sheltered in some ways because we didn't have the social media or the internet, but not to say that atrocities weren't happening around the world, because of course they were. So with that character and with that murder, it was going to be something quite gruesome, because although the Nancy's is playing with that cozy convention, you've got amateur detectives, small town, there's a cat. I also wanted it to be, murder is murder. And I think for cozy readers, we've kind of got away with, someone was pushed off a cliff, or the person was old anyway. And that kind of thing is like, no, it's still a murder. So you're going to have a murder, we're going to give you a murder. So it was sort of, again, with Nancy Business, looking at that external world and then kind of putting it in a microcosm of a small town. But one of the things which I found with having a child protagonist is, particularly in crime fiction, is this is a child that has optimism and hope, and they aren't jaded and cynical yet, like like a lot of the adult protagonists you have in crime fiction, and understand them because they've had trauma after trauma after trauma. So I thought that was an interesting way of looking at crime fiction, adult crime fiction, and having someone dealing with a lot of darkness, but with that baseline of hope. And I think that's what gives the book a lot of its joy, is because it's looking through that lens. Yeah.
It is a nice way to flip the script, because there are many crime series that have the grizzled, old, wizened ex-detective. I mean, I love Bosch as much as anyone, but there are many Bosches in the world, and it's nice to flip the script, especially considering, as you just said as well, Agatha Christie still reigns large. So it's nice to see an injection of female heroines in there, and young as well. It is a really beautiful way to read the book as well, because there is that desire to do right. Yeah. Which I think is maybe forgotten a bit in some of the grittier crime that's out there as well. What about you, Lyn?
For me, one of the things that I wanted to achieve in writing the book was to talk about, Rob mentioned about societal issues before, to talk about the ramifications of childhood abuse, so that it's no secret in the book, like it's no reveal or anything, that in the book, the children of the family are physically abused by the father, who's a bit of a tyrant. And I wanted to talk about the long-term ramifications of that sort of abuse. So I wanted to show it from both the child's perspective, the protagonist's name is Joy, kind of ironically, and then also from her perspective as an adult. So I wanted readers to have some sort of almost vicarious experience, I guess, of what it was like to have some very dark, difficult experiences as a child, and then to come back as an adult. And so we have those two perspectives of Joy's experiences. But I think also there is something about seeing the world through a child's eye, and I loved reading when I was a child, and I loved what books and reading could do, the way that they opened up the world to us. But we still saw the world through a child's eye, even if we were reading slightly older books as we got older. I just think there's something magical about how a child perceives the world, and Tippy is just absolutely extraordinary. If you haven't read it, you've just got to go and do it. Joy's perspective is a lot darker, but there is still some hope, and she still finds escape from the darkness, and I think there's something about how children can do that even under very difficult circumstances. So I did want to show that perspective as well.
Again, I think you flipped the script brilliantly, because in a lot of crime fiction, and I think this is something that Helen Mirren, I want to say, said during her silent witness era or after it, she said, dead women abound in crime on the shows, in the books. So it's kind of nice that you showed somebody who, as a child, could have been the victim and then just forgotten, but to show them grow up and survive and continue to survive and then have that drive.
Although she is highly flawed.
Highly flawed, but that's survival as well. That's coming out the other side. That is, you wear your trauma, your body keeps the score. So it is really nice, again, that you flip the script by centering someone who would have once upon a time just been the dead girl at the beginning, and then having a grizzled, wizened detective, male, most likely, solve it. But no, you've positioned women again, which I think is, both of you flip the script really nicely in crime, and you're sort of writing a new wave of crime fiction, which I kind of love.
Oh, I like that.
So congrats.
We'll own that.
Yeah, we'll take that.
Now I'm hoping that we're at the point in this little discussion where the crowd would like to hear a little bit of your writing. So could we please clear the airwaves? I would love for each of you to read a little section of your books, please. Rob, are you ready?
Yeah, sure.
You're in the reading chair. I do love it. It's a little bit play school, and I love that.
It's fantastic. So this is near the beginning, so chapter 2. And this is, so Tippy's our main protagonist, so it's from her point of view. So just to set the scene, her uncle and Devon have arrived, and she's staying with them in a Airbnb in the centre of town. It took ages to get to sleep. The curtains didn't quite pull together, and the wall opposite my window glowed orange from the street lights outside. Late night trucks rattled and rumbled in the distance. I lay on my side, staring at the wide stripe of bright light. My bedroom at home was pitch black compared to this. Dad. I couldn't believe it was only 1 year ago. I remembered crying myself to sleep that first night after Dad died, then waking up the next morning and not remembering for a couple of wonderful seconds before it hit me all over again. At his hospital bed with Mum holding his warm, dry hand, and then the silence when the life support stopped. I curled up in my Airbnb bed, lowering my head and crossing my arms like a sleeping bat. It still hit me that I'd never see him again. My eyes would sting and I'd have to remember to breathe. Around me the old wooden cottage creaked. Our house did the same. Mum called it settling in for the night. She was working close by on Main Street, only 2 blocks away. She left me to go to work on Dad's first anniversary? Who does that? I pulled my knees up higher and closed my eyes, trying to stop my thoughts and go to sleep. The sound of the toilet flushing comforted me. I wasn't alone. Finally, I drifted off. All of a sudden, there was a jolt so hard I fell out of bed onto the floor. The house shook. Earthquake. A split second later, from outside came the loudest explosion I'd ever heard. Crashing and smashing noises came from the next room, then a sharp crack like thunder. My ears rang and I covered my head, expecting the window to smash and glass to fly inside. Loud banging like giant hail rained on the corrugated iron roof. I worried the ceiling would cave in. Outside, car alarms went off and dogs lost it. My bedroom light flicked on, blinding me. As my eyes adjusted, Uncle Pike and Devon stood above me, dazed. "You okay?" they yelled. My hearing was muffled, but I nodded. Uncle Pike helped me up and out to the living room, where the bookcase lay skewered on the rug, its books and puzzle pieces splattered everywhere. Broken glass and smashed plates covered the kitchen bench and floor. "What's happening?" I cried, crouching and covering my head with my hands. Outside, a loud mechanical wail sounded. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as it continued. "What is that?" Devon asked. "Town siren," Uncle Pike said. We followed him carefully through the broken glass to the kitchen window. We all gasped. Above the orange street lights rose a huge cloud of dust and black smoke. It mushroomed over the roofs by Main Street and was lit underneath by a deep flickering glow, which could only be fire. Mum's work. Uncle Pike grabbed our wrists and dragged us away from the window. "That wasn't an earthquake," he said. "That was an explosion." I didn't wait. I yanked my gumboots on and ran.
If you want to know what happens next, you know what you have to do. Lyn, you're up.
Okay, I'm just going to start from the beginning because then I don't have to tell any context.
It's a good beginning. Go for it.
Thank you. 1983. The moment he dies, the room explodes with life. I'm up, pulling open drawers and dragging out underpants, singlets and socks with ugly, trawling fingers. I'm probably in too much of a hurry, but there you go. I don't care. I wonder why I didn't do this sooner, why I waited until the end. I can't find it. I want to ring Mark, but of course I can't, and scream, "He's dead, he's dead. Do you know where it is?" He'd say, "On the nail." I'd say, "Nail? What nail?" "In the wardrobe." I yank open the single door of the old wardrobe and stare at the clothes hanging there. 13 sets of clothes he hung with obsessive care and put on so many times they took on his shape. 13 images of my father. One by one, I pull them out and toss them onto the floor. Dad, the longest standing elder. Dad in the vegetable garden. Dad trying to impress the bank manager. Dad playing bowls. Dad fishing. Dad fixing fences. Dad killing Ruths. I stop. All those chooks, over all those years, each one called Ruth, each one beheaded by him on the chopping block. I throw Dad killing Ruths to the floor and continue. Dad praying with Mr. and Mrs. Boscombe after Wendy disappeared. Poor Wendy Boscombe. Ruth was right when she said they'd never find her or her missing doll. Dad playing in the band. Dad at hall committee meetings. Dad at Bible study. Dad milking cows. Dad goal umpiring. White trousers, white shirt, long white coat. Like a modern day angel. Right at the back, I notice. I stick my hand into the darkness and my palm hits something sharp. I peer in, and there it is. One solitary nail hammered into wood. And hanging on the nail is a belt. One belt and 10,000 magenta screams. I see my father pushing back his disguises and reaching in for that belt, oblivious to the old screams in there, then later hanging it up delicately, obsessively, oblivious to the new screams. I unhook it and hold it in my hand. It's a simple farmer's belt. Wait, allow me to clarify. Not the belt of a simple farmer, but a simple belt that belongs to a farmer. Correction, belonged. Past tense, which tastes delicious on my tongue.
I do love the killing Ruths. All of them are called Ruth. Oh, what a psycho. So in the Nancys, the small town is Riverstone. In The Silent Listener, the small town is Black Hunt. Crime aficionados are well acquainted with the small town mystery, from Corston in Midsummer Murders to Broadchurch, a fictional English town in Dorset. Even true crime fans know the small town well. Holcomb in Kansas is where the murder of a family took place, and the author Truman Capote swept in to write about it in Cold Blood. In fact, years later, locals recounted what it was like to be under Capote's pen and have the spotlight swung on their town. Neighbourliness evaporated. The natural order seemed suspended. Chaos poised to rush in. Let's talk about small towns in your respective books. and why the small town abounds for fertile criminal ground. And I'd especially like to touch on the differences between writing small town and big city, and what helped you to decide early on which one best suited your stories. Rob, why the small town?
So I grew up on a farm. So our nearest town was about 20 minutes on the gravel road on the in the Ford Fairlane. And population of that town was 250. I think it's now 320. So, you know, it's nearly doubled. And then Riverstone, which is a fictional town, is based on Balclutha, which was about 40 minutes drive. So it was like a, you know, town. And it was also just out of Balclutha that there's the one traffic light for the whole region. So it was a place I've known all my life. So when it came to setting the Nancys, it was a place that I was drawn to. Also for Tippy's character, I recognised that longing for something exciting, for something more, and I guess it's that grass is always greener, thinking that city kids had this amazing, you know, exciting life. And the thing with small towns also, you've got that, I guess, level of trust and safety that was interesting to play with. Also for amateur detectives, you know, when a lot of people know each other's business, it makes for interviewing witnesses that much better. And I guess with Nancy business, you're looking at what happens when that trust is suddenly jeopardised, when a loved member of the community's the perpetrator. What does that mean to a community? So it was sort of a combination of all of that. But it was that idea, I think, initially of Tippy. I could feel that yearning. I understood that wanting something exciting to happen, and then also then playing with her Uncle Pike, who escaped the small town as soon as he could, and relating to that as well.
It is also an interesting Paradise Lost. It's an interesting tipping point for Tippy when everything has changed and there's very much a crack down the middle of the town. That's really interesting. Versus somebody who grew up knowing that the world is not perfect, being a bit of a survivor. So it's a really interesting contrast. But then that you also kept it in a small town as well. What was your driver for that decision, Lyn?
I think that one of the advantages or perceived advantages of living in a small town is that everybody knows one another, but of course it's also a disadvantage that you can't hide. But and I think what I've tried to do in The Silent Listener is actually show that people in small communities often know the secrets of people living there, but no one talks about them. So there's a few secrets that go on in The Silent Listener that everybody knows about, but they don't talk about. And so that I think that's sort of an added layer of, well, at what point should a community speak up if something is happening within a family that shouldn't be happening, in abuse or sexual abuse, or you know, there can be all kinds of things happening, and what does that mean for the people living in that family and for the community, and how do they react when the truth bubbles to the surface and everybody's kind of saying, well, or pretending that they didn't know about it, but they actually did. So I think it's harder to create that in an urban setting where, you know, people who go to the same school might live, you know, 50 miles away from one another, or you know, go to different churches or go to different shopping centres and things like that. But when you confine everything to a rural area in a small town, you've got that closeness that can create, you know, tension and conflict, and that sort of hiding of secrets or hinting at secrets that everybody knows. So that worked for me. Plus, like Rob, I grew up on a farm near a small town, so it's just very easy to draw on all of those things that we're familiar with. And one of the other things I did want to do was show that perhaps rural living isn't everything that people in the city think that it is. So I remember not so long ago, my brother and I were taking my mum out for Mother's Day, and we grew up in Gippsland where it's very wet and cold, but green and hilly, and my sister-in-law who was with us looked out, and it was a wet, cold, miserable day, which it always was when I grew up. And my sister-in-law looked out of the window and said, "Gosh, isn't it just beautiful here, these green rolling hills?" And my brother and my mother and I said nothing. And then my brother said, "I look out the window and I see mud and chores." And, you know, that is that battle that people living on farms have again with the climate and the weather and the landscape and all of that kind of thing. And I remember also when I went to uni in, well, I admit this, 1976, and I was in a literature class and everyone was talking about, I don't know why, farms, and everybody there was from the city except for me, and they all had this idyllic picture of farms where there were goats and horses and chickens and pigs and cows and a plump little, you know, farmer's wife who cooked lamingtons, and the sun was always shining and there were little ducks, and, you know, and I just sat there appalled that they had no idea what it was really like. So unapologetically I tried to kind of break that myth a little bit.
Port Fairy is lovely though.
It is,
Yeah,
it absolutely
absolutely.
is. Yes.
To be clear.
Yeah.
I'm talking about Gippsland, it's completely different
Oh,
here.
Gippsland people, no. I'm actually also curious, as an addendum to that, now that you're both out of your respective small towns, do you have any desire to write about a big city crime set novel, do you think? Or do you think a big city novel is oftentimes too procedural? Like, you know, it is often attributed to ex-police force or ex-detective. You know, there's generally someone associated with a bigger organisation. It's very rarely like a child detective in a big city novel. So do you have any desire, to either of you, to write a big city crime novel?
I think I wouldn't mind, just because I don't think I want to always set everything in the country and make out that country living is terrible, or I think as a, you know, challenge for me to say, well, I don't have to just draw on what I know as a child. So actually in my next novel there's a bit of a political thread, and I haven't quite moved it to the city, but I think I've moved it to Ballarat, so I've taken half a step.
Slowly inching away.
Yeah, get in there.
Rob, any desire?
Yeah, look, if the right story came along, yeah. I don't, you know, someone said about the Nancy's visiting Sydney. I mean, maybe that could happen one day. I think, yeah, I mean, the city is interesting as a setting because you've got that anonymity and, you know, so it would be, yeah, it would certainly explore that. But yeah, it would have to be the right story. Yeah.
I think we've been wheeling around this because as soon as you were talking, Lyn, about the kind of need for a claustrophobic small community, I did think that there's lots of instances of Australian crime writers or noir writers maybe hedging into that area, like Leanne Moriarty setting a story in her school district. You know, the kids of a school district, that's still a community, so they still keep it small. So I wonder if, I would just love to hear from both of you, Australian and New Zealand crime writing as distinct from every place else in the world, you know, the Nordic noirs. What makes our crime writing distinct? What are its markers? And particularly in contrast to the US, UK, or just European generally, what do you think makes an Australian or New Zealand crime novel that? There are no wrong answers.
Sorry,
Yes,
if Rob
go.
has the same
Yeah.
idea, he won't take it from me. I think there's something about the extreme distances in Australia, of course, that everything is in the country a long way away from everywhere else. And so it creates this isolation where you are, as someone in the book, you're almost trapped in that small area, and as you know, if you've got a cop in it or amateur detectives, you've got a closed group of people that you know one of them has to be the baddie, and you know one of them is going to solve it. because it's pretty hard to bring in. I mean, I guess you can bring in people who've, you know, the cop from the city who arrives, which I guess is sort of what Jane Harper did in The Dry. But I think there's something about saying, okay, everything's just set in this closed place and it's a long way from everywhere else. So there's something, I guess, about the Australian landscape, even though it's different, you know, obviously in every state and territory, or even within a state and territory. But I think it's that extreme. We have extreme climates, we have extreme landscapes, we have extreme distances, and I think that is a hotbed for conflict and trouble and hiding secrets, and that's what appeals to me. And I think a lot of us, you know, well, dare I say us and talk about Jane Harper in the same breath, but, you know, we draw on some of those extremes to create pictures that are really strong and stay with people and are perfect for cinema. So,
yeah, yes. what Lyn said. Yeah, and I think part of that, I guess, with the outback and that is around, you know, water is fairly essential. So what happens when that's really scarce? The same with supplies. But then I suppose you could say with Scandi, they've got the freezing cold, and you know. But I think
that's the extremes again.
Yeah, yeah, and I think we were talking about it with New Zealand and Australian, where perhaps some books in the UK and the US are very strongly commercial genre. There seems to be more of a melding of literary and crime together, which is interesting. And I guess it's it's our Australian and New Zealand culture, and in terms of, you know, there's usually sort of some kind of humour infused, particularly in like New Zealand books, and yeah, it's an interesting question, because if you take the setting out, what is it that is different?
Is there also some sort of romanticism for the rest of the world about Australia, you know, and New Zealand? We're right down the bottom. We're, you know, you have to get on a plane and travel for 17 hours to get there. So I don't know whether there's some sort of romanticised idea that they might have about Australia, and then that whole crime thing. We've got, you know, convicts in our history.
Yeah, they just assume. I guess US, maybe this is crime thriller more than anything, but they do the big commercial books that are one bloke who is what carries the series, and he swans in and out of towns, and each book is him going to, I'm thinking like the Jack Reachers, you know, he just goes to a different town, which kind of hints that the Americans maybe not so grounded to a place. Whereas I do think Australian and New Zealand crime fiction, you tend to be grounded and almost stuck in one place. Even the Drive with Jane Harper, that is someone who grew up in a small town, went to the city, and then was drawn back into the evolving crime. Maybe. Maybe. Now, I am going to pause in a second for questions from the audience. So if you have a question that you'd like to start, you know, constructing the sentence in your head, would be fab. No comments, just questions. No spoilers as well. If you've read the books, please don't give away who done it. My goodness, that should be number one rule. Genres, though, are products of their time. They don't exist in a vacuum. Oftentimes, historic and social events help shape fictional ones. And Rob, you commented on this as kind of your inspiration for why you included a child character, seeing what your daughters were growing up in and what was happening in the world. But as another example, the great financial crisis of 2007 to 2008 saw the rise in dystopian fiction for young adults. Roman-style arenas pitting teenagers against each other for the amusement of adults. This was seen as a direct influence of the GFC and the unequal burden young people were being made to carry. I'm curious to know what outside influences informed your books and your predictions for how you and other crime writers might interpret these pandemic years in storytelling to come. So, a quick question before I turn to the audience.
I've forgotten the question. No. I think I sort of cheated because I set my novel back in the 40s, 60s and 80s. So part of that was because I wanted to draw on my own experiences, although I'm not quite as old as Joy would be. I'll just make that clear. I'm not as old as Joy would be if she was still alive. But I did also consciously not want to have to cope with or deal with mobile phones and DNA and those advanced criminal tools. And I have heard that a lot of other crime writers are doing the same thing because it's so easy, of course, to find out where someone was based on their mobile phone movements and stuff like that. So it's hard, apparently, to draw out the crime or the solving of the crime. So I was very happy to set this pre-pandemic, well, I started writing it before the pandemic, of course, pre-DNA, pre-all of that. And I think there's something comfortable and familiar about crime writing for all of us, that we're used to that sort of thing, harking back to Agatha Christie again and those cosy murder mysteries and so on. So I don't know, I do forget the question.
What do you think will influence crime writing given the pandemic years? How do you think that will out in crime stories? Although we've already discussed that, Australia and New Zealand tends to keep them claustrophobic anyway.
Yeah.
So, or will we rebound and go in the opposite direction?
I actually think that the whole pandemic thing is going to become kind of an underneath layer for crime writers in the future, that it won't be the central element of, well, it might be for some people, but generally speaking, I think we'll steer clear of it a little bit, because I think we've all just had so much of it that while we can't ignore it if we're going to write about anything happening after 2020, I think that we're also going to underplay it a little bit and try and focus more on the crime and the characters and all that sort of thing, rather than, drowning us all in pandemic restrictions and things like that. But we'll find, it'll be interesting to watch what happens.
Yeah. Rob, what do you think?
Yeah, I think at the moment, a majority of people are looking for an escape from, rather than wanting to read about being in a lockdown. But
it could create some interesting scenarios, though, couldn't it? Being in a lockdown.
Absolutely. A good writer friend, Catherine Kovacic, has already, sorted out the Zoom murder where you've got your background and it's, you're somewhere else topping someone, and so yeah, look for that one. But yeah, so what I'm currently working on is set in 1933, so I'm kind of really escaping it, but it's so interesting that time and now, and so I think once we're past this current pandemic and with vaccinations and everything, I think the trend would be then to look back more so. But saying that, there are movies coming out now which are set around lockdown, which are actually really interesting and yeah.
If anyone's curious for my prediction, I think the rise of the QAnon and conspiracy theories and the anti-science movement might will out in crime fiction. And I think we'll see probably a lot more political crime novels, particularly out of America, given what happened in the Capitol. I mean, they very nearly had an insurrection. I think Americans are going to have to deal with that in their fiction in some capacity. But I do think, the rise of the conspiracy theorists and the anti-science may come out in crime fiction. I know for a fact that there are some writers who are delving into those worlds right now for research, and I think, have at it. I do not want to touch that with a 10-foot barge. But it'll be interesting to see how it wills out in crime fiction, which I think is one of the most reflective genres of what society is currently going through, as was the lead up to that question. So thank you both for that. Now I will say, can we have a show of hands if anyone has a question in the audience? Oh, I love it. She who has the microphone can just choose. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. That was amazing. Thank you. A bit of a technical question about your plotting for both of you. Can you tell us a bit about how you go about the plotting, not only of the crime but of the investigation. Do you write a plot outline? Love to hear about it.
I'm a pantser, as they say. I write by the seat of my pants, but I get to a point where I think, okay, I actually have to work out a little bit of what's going to happen, or I want to work out how am I going to get characters or events from here to here. Sort of know this bit and I know this bit, but how I'm going to achieve that can be tricky. So I will actually try and write out those things, and I do it on a piece of paper, which I then cut up, and then so I can move things around a little bit until I think, yes, that's going to work and it's realistic. But I like things evolving and letting, I don't know, for example, in this, when I started writing this book, there was no cop in it at all. And then, you know, people say this, and I used to think it was rubbish, but then he sort of popped up on the screen, and I thought, oh, this is interesting. Yeah, I'll go with this and see where I get to. And I liked it, and I liked him and what I could do with him. So I continued. But so I mostly let things evolve. But when I have a problem to solve, I'll sit down and try and plot it out step by step, and then go back and write it.
Yeah, and I'm a pantser, although with Nancy Business, I've become more of a plantser.
Yeah, good. Excellent. I'm
so
using
that's a
that
plotter,
word.
Pantser. For my first draft, I just let the story take me where it wants to go. And then from there I use, but I always base it on a actual calendar period. So it's usually a 2-week period set in. So with the Nancys, it was December. I set it because I needed Christmas to fall on a certain day. So I think it might have been 2016, but that was purely for where the days were. Then that's how I have my macro view, and I'll put each scene in like a sort of meeting. From there, I'm able to overlay where the clues are dropping, and so then I can see, okay, too much is happening here, or we need to move this here. And so, by using that, and then something that I do, again, it's usually after the first draft, is I'll write down just for myself, from the point of view of the murderer, a timeline of how they did the crime. So then I can, so there's a lot of kind of re-engineering after, so redrafting and going back and putting in those details or... so that's how I do it. It's probably a lot longer than if I'd actually plotted it, but it's the way I like to work, and I feel it's more organic around finding the story.
How beholden are you to, do you go back and look at what the weather patterns were doing in the 2-week period? You do? And if you see there was like a sun shower, you're like, all right, what's going in a second?
Yeah, because this is great details that are, there.
One of the best tips I ever got was, if you're ever stuck in a scene, change the weather. If you ever need to. Which also kind of means you've got to get them outside at some point. So if you're ever stuck in a scene, change the weather, or look at the weather patterns. Yeah. Choose a time period and let the weather tell you what to write. I really like that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Next microphone holder.
Genres inherently have tropes and cliches and things that make them genres. So how do you find the line between doing that and doing something distinctive to set your book apart?
Well, I didn't set out to write genre, so hopefully there aren't too many recognisable sort of tropes and cliched events or narrative arcs happening. But I think it's okay to have some, because I think we make a contract with readers. This is the sort of book that I'm providing you with. There's going to be some parts of it that you recognise and feel comfortable with in terms of how the story progresses and things like setting up clues or red herrings and the types of characters that there are, knowing that also we might mess with them, and there's got to be a level of unpredictability and a few, hopefully, moments where you gasp with surprise or shock or outrage or maybe even laugh or something like that. But if we just stick to, well, I know Rob hasn't, and I don't think I did either, we haven't stuck to formulas by any stretch of the imagination. And for me, I don't want to do that. So I don't know. I don't think. I mean, there are crimes in here, but in some respects, I kind of don't think it's a crime novel in the normal sense. So, yeah, I like the idea that I didn't plan it out to be have a narrative arc that's standard or typical of crime novels. So, hopefully, that sort of works. Not too many cliches or events or characters that are predictable.
And I think with those tropes and stereotypes, it's fun to play with, and I think it's good to. So for when I was writing the Nancys, we were told at Faber Academy to look up rules of the genre. So I looked at them, but it was also you still write the story, so I think of course. It's fine to break rules as long as you know why you're breaking them, and it makes sense rather than just breaking them for the sake of breaking them. And I think it's the same with tropes and with stereotypes. Playing with that and playing with your readers' expectations around that is also great, and I think that's part of the fun with crime fiction because readers are so used to, they know the rules, they know the tropes, so if you can surprise them within that, I think that's one of the best things you can do as a writer.
Yeah, very true. Very quickly, are there any other questions from the audience? Oh yeah, one more down the front-ish.
Thank you. I'll pass the mic there. Just wondering, both of you with options, you can't say a lot about it, but the crafts are different between writing a novel and then doing writing for screen or for stage or whatever. Do either of you have any aspirations to take that leap into the next part of the craft?
I've said I'm as available as they'll want me to. I mean, I think it would be an incredible apprenticeship for sure. But you're absolutely right. The experts who know, this is such a different field, writing for television or writing for film. It's something I'm definitely interested in. So yeah, if I could get, even to visit the writing room for one day would be incredible, let alone for
just
longer.
offer to fetch the tea even.
Yeah.
Tea runner, I'll do it.
So yeah, certainly something I'd be interested in learning for sure.
Well, I am lucky enough to know that I am going to sit down with an experienced screenwriter and work out whether this is going to be a TV series or a film. So I know that I am going to do that, so that's kind of pretty exciting in itself. And then I am hoping that when we go to the next stage, I'll be invited to make tea for the people in the film room, but in the writers' room. I think for novelists, I just think that concept of taking something to film and understanding the difference between it is really terrific. And last week I was in a 3.5-hour bus ride from Sydney to Ulladulla with Rosalie Ham, who wrote The Dressmaker, and her producer, Sue Maslin. And so I told them about the film or the options, and we had a really long talk about how it goes from book to screen. And it's just really fascinating. Probably the most amazing bit is how much money it takes. So that's a really interesting part of it that I certainly can't contribute to, but I hope that I can contribute to the writing, so it'd be fantastic.
I think no matter what, you don't want to be late to the bandwagon. You don't want to be that person that goes out and buys the book as soon as you see the trailer drop. So you may want to buy the book today and then become part of the crowd once you know what the adaptation's going to be. You can be the one telling all your friends, oh, the book is so good. Because you like being that person, don't you? You like being the person that says, I've read the book. All those smarmy people who read all of Game of Thrones and knew everything that was coming, you want to be that person next. So please go and buy a copy. And that is us done for this particular session. Thank you kindly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, everybody. We've got a little gift for each of our authors. One for you, Lyn.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Have a good look at it, Ron.
Oh my God!
Oh, wow.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Oh, thank you, Joe. Oh,
That's so good.
that's awesome.